In the twilight of the 1930s, the Empire of Japan was at the peak of its confidence. Its factories worked around the clock forging steel. Its shipyards launched magnificent vessels that gleamed like floating fortresses, and its admirals dreamed of a Pacific dominated entirely by the rising sun. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not merely an arm of the military, it was a symbol of national pride, the embodiment of a warrior nation that believed itself destined to rule the seas.
Every sailor, every engineer, every officer carried the conviction that Japan's destiny was preordained.
The Japanese had built this belief on a philosophy older than their empire itself. For generations, they had been guided by the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was a doctrine that exalted courage, loyalty, and discipline above all else. To die for one's emperor was the highest honor, and to fight with spirit and precision was the truest measure of greatness. In this world of rigid hierarchy and ritual, technology was not seen as the master of warfare, but merely as a servant to the warrior's will. And so, when whispers began to circulate in scientific circles about an emerging technology in Europe and America, something called radio detection, the Japanese reaction was one of polite indifference, even skepticism. The idea that one could see an enemy aircraft or ship using invisible radio waves seemed like a fantasy. To the old guard officers in the Imperial Navy, it was absurd to think a machine could replace the trained eye of a lookout or the intuition of a seasoned commander. The sea, in their view, belonged to those who could read its moods, sense its dangers, and react with the instinct of warriors, not scientists. By 1935, however, the world was already shifting beneath their feet. In Britain, experimental radar stations were being built along the coast. Tall steel towers emitting pulses of energy that could detect incoming aircraft long before they reached the shore. Across the Atlantic, American physicists and naval engineers were experimenting with similar ideas, bouncing radio waves off ships and recording the faint echoes that returned. But in Tokyo, where the Imperial Navy planned its future, the focus remained firmly on what was visible and tangible: ships, guns, and aircraft. Japan's engineers were by no means ignorant. In fact, many were among the most talented scientists in Asia. They had mastered metallurgy, precision optics, and aeronautical engineering. Their shipyards produced the largest battleships ever constructed, the mighty Yamato and Musashi, each a floating city of armor and firepower. Their aircraft carriers were designed for lightning-fast attacks, and their Zero fighters were among the most agile in the world. To Japanese leadership, these were the instruments of destiny, the proof that human craftsmanship and courage could conquer the modern age. But radar, this strange, intangible idea of using invisible energy to perceive what the eyes could not, found little favor. When a handful of Japanese researchers at the Naval Technical Research Institute began experimenting with radio waves in 1936, they were treated as dreamers. Their prototype, a crude device that could detect ships at short distances, was dismissed by senior officers. Reports describing the system's potential to see through fog and darkness were quietly shelved. "We already have lookouts and searchlights," one admiral reportedly remarked, "and their eyes never fail when guided by discipline." This belief was not mere arrogance, it was cultural. Japan's military leaders believed that human spirit, seishin, was superior to mechanical reliance. The warrior's soul was pure. Machines could fail, but courage could not. Their doctrine emphasized surprise, maneuver, and precision strikes, the skills of a disciplined navy trained to fight by instinct. They believed wars were won by men, not by machines. What they did not realize was that the machine was about to redefine what it meant to see. Across the Pacific, American naval officers were already investing in radar research. The U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., had begun experimenting with pulse-based detection as early as 1934. Their goal was simple but visionary: to create a system that could alert ships of approaching aircraft or submarines before they could be seen or heard. To the Americans, radar was not science fiction. It was a necessity in an age of fast-moving threats.
By the late 1930s, the United States had working prototypes capable of detecting aircraft over long distances. These systems, though still secret, were already shaping the future of naval strategy. The Japanese, however, continued to trust in their tradition. Even as their intelligence agencies intercepted reports about British radio location systems, their leaders remained unconvinced. They believed that the empire's strength lay in training, discipline, and the skill of its pilots and navigators. "The West hides behind machines," said one senior officer in 1938. "We rely on our spirit." It was a sentiment that reflected Japan's broader worldview at the time, a belief that the nation's cultural superiority could overcome Western technology. In fairness, Japan's scientists were not completely blind to the potential of radar. Some engineers at the Tokyo Imperial University and the Naval Technical Research Institute saw its promise and urged further development. They understood that in a modern war, information would be as important as firepower. But their voices were faint against the roar of tradition. Budgets were tight, and every yen was funneled toward shipbuilding, aircraft production, and munitions. The empire's ambitions demanded immediate, tangible results, not theoretical breakthroughs. When the Japanese Navy began to prepare for large-scale war in the Pacific, radar was still an afterthought. Their military strategists focused instead on perfecting carrier-based warfare, emphasizing coordinated strikes, stealth, and speed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the culmination of this philosophy, a masterpiece of planning, timing, and human precision. It relied on secrecy, silence, and surprise, and in December 1941, it seemed to work perfectly. The American fleet was caught completely off guard, and the world gasped at Japan's brilliance. Yet, hidden within that very attack lay the seed of Japan's downfall. Only hours before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a young American radar operator stationed at Opana Point had detected the incoming Japanese planes. The signal appeared clearly on his screen, dozens of blips moving steadily toward Oahu. He reported the anomaly to his superiors, but his warning was dismissed as a false alarm. The Americans, too, had not yet learned to trust radar. And so, the Japanese struck without interference. But what Japan failed to grasp was that the Americans were learning fast. The shock of Pearl Harbor forced the United States to re-examine every aspect of its defense systems, and radar was pushed to the forefront. Within months, radar research exploded across American laboratories. Massive investments poured into development, leading to systems that could detect aircraft, ships, and even the periscope of a submarine. What Japan had once dismissed as impossible was about to become the most devastatingly effective technology of the war. Back in Tokyo, a few engineers began to realize their mistake. Reports from the front lines mentioned strange sightings, American ships detecting Japanese forces long before they were visible. Night attacks, once Japan's specialty, began to fail inexplicably. Yet, even then, senior officers refused to believe that an invisible technology could outmatch human skill. The old guard continued to insist that superior training and discipline would triumph, even as evidence piled up to the contrary. This stubbornness was not unique to Japan. It was a common trait of powerful nations that had once relied on human mastery. But for Japan, it was fatal. Their engineers, bound by hierarchy and deference, could not challenge their superiors' beliefs. Those who proposed radical innovations risked ridicule or even demotion. The empire's military system prized obedience over invention, tradition over experimentation. And so, while the United States and Britain built radar networks that blanketed the skies, Japan sailed into war with eyes half closed. They believed their pilots could always see farther, their ships could always strike first,
and their spirit would always prevail. But in modern warfare, spirit was no longer enough. The age of machines had arrived, and those who failed to embrace it would soon find themselves crushed beneath it. Japan's engineers would one day look back on those years with regret. They would remember how their warnings were ignored, how their prototypes were dismissed, and how their nation's faith in the past blinded them to the future. The tragedy was not that Japan lacked intelligence or skill, it was that they lacked belief in the unseen. When the war began, Japan's confidence seemed unshakable, but as history would soon show, even the proudest empire can fall when it refuses to see what lies just beyond the horizon. The arrogance of power, the faith in human skill over machine innovation would prove to be Japan's first and greatest mistake, a mistake that would echo through every battle that followed. The late 1930s were a time when the world was walking blindfolded toward destruction. Empires flexed their power, war machines rolled across continents, and scientists worked feverishly behind locked doors to give their nations an edge that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In America, hidden behind the unassuming walls of laboratories and naval research centers, a quiet revolution was taking shape. One that would not explode like a bomb, but hum softly like a heartbeat through the ether. It was called radio detection and ranging, radar. Japan's radar program was fractured across multiple branches: the Navy, the Army, and private research institutes, each working in isolation, often in secrecy from one another. The Imperial Army's engineers developed one system for anti-aircraft defense, while the Navy pursued another for shipborne detection. Resources were duplicated, results were inconsistent, and time was slipping away. The Americans, by contrast, were producing radar units in the tens of thousands, small, powerful, and reliable. The Japanese could barely manage dozens. Their vacuum tubes burned out quickly, their frequencies were unstable, and their displays flickered like dying lanterns. Many of the early radar sets could barely detect a plane 10 miles away. Against the vastness of the Pacific, it was like trying to see the horizon through a keyhole. Still, there were flashes of brilliance amid the desperation. In 1943, Japanese scientists succeeded in building the Type 21 air search radar, one of the first functional naval radar systems deployed on their destroyers and carriers. It was crude but functional, capable of spotting aircraft at moderate distances. Operators were hastily trained, though few understood the physics behind what they were using. For many sailors, it was magic in a metal box. They called it the wave eye. But radar alone could not save them. The American advantage had grown into something far larger than a single invention. It had become an ecosystem. Allied radar was now integrated with advanced communication networks, cryptography, and aerial coordination. While Japan's sets worked in isolation, American radar operators were part of a living system, feeding data into tactical command centers that could visualize entire battles in real time. The difference was as profound as it was invisible. Japan was still fighting a war of courage and instinct. America was fighting a war of mathematics and machines. As 1944 dawned, Japan's desperation grew. The Navy ordered all major warships to be equipped with radar, but production bottlenecks made that impossible. The few ships that received working units often had their systems malfunction during battle due to poor power regulation or sea damage. The Imperial Navy's pride, the Yamato and Musashi, were eventually outfitted with radar sets, but even these mighty vessels were haunted by the ghosts of inefficiency. In contrast, American ships were becoming floating fortresses of information. Their radar-guided gunnery could strike unseen targets with uncanny precision. Their night fighter squadrons, equipped with airborne radar, hunted Japanese bombers in the darkness like predators guided by invisible sight. Battles that once belonged to the daring now belonged to the data. When the Americans invaded the Mariana Islands in mid-1944, radar played a decisive role once more.
The skies above the Philippine Sea became the stage for one of the largest aerial battles in history, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, brave but inexperienced, launched wave after wave of attacks. Yet radar-equipped American carriers saw them coming hundreds of miles away. Fighter control officers calmly vectored interceptors toward the incoming formations long before they could even glimpse the U.S. fleet. By the time the first Japanese planes reached their targets, the sky was littered with burning wrecks. For every American pilot lost, 10 Japanese fell. The Empire's air power, already fragile after Midway, was shattered. And still, their scientists worked tirelessly in the shadows, producing new radar designs that were smaller, more precise, more stable. But by the time they reached the battlefield, the war had already outrun their science. Japan's laboratories became symbols of tragic irony, rooms filled with brilliance, haunted by the ghosts of bureaucracy and delay. Engineers toiled by candlelight as Allied bombers roared overhead. Copper wires were scavenged from civilian radios. Oscilloscopes were rebuilt from broken parts. They knew what needed to be done. They simply no longer had the means to do it. By late 1944, the Allies had radar networks stretching from Australia to Alaska. Japan's once mighty fleet was now fragmented and blind, hunted by unseen eyes. Every convoy, every movement, every desperate escape was detected before it began. Radar had not only changed the war, it had revealed a deeper truth. The battlefield of the future would belong to those who could perceive it first. As Tokyo burned and the Pacific filled with wreckage, Japan's radar engineers worked until the very end, many refusing to flee their labs even as bombs fell around them. They were men who finally understood what they had missed, how a handful of radio waves could decide the fate of empires. The tragedy was not that Japan lacked intelligence, but that it had failed to believe in the invisible. The Pacific War ended not with the roar of guns, but with the silence that followed an unbearable light. When the mushroom clouds rose above Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the world crossed into a new age of terror and technology. Yet beneath that cataclysmic finale lay another revolution, quieter but no less profound. Radar, born from invisible waves, nurtured in secrecy and forged in desperation, had already changed the meaning of war forever. When Japan surrendered, the empire that once dismissed radar as impossible stood in ruins. Its cities smoldered, its navy lay at the bottom of the sea, and its skies were no longer its own. The nation that once prided itself on precision engineering and divine discipline had been defeated by a weapon it could not see and had refused to believe in. The invisible had conquered the invincible. In the months that followed, Allied scientists and intelligence officers poured into Japan. They searched universities, factories, and laboratories, collecting research notes and equipment. What they found was both tragic and astonishing. Hidden in underground tunnels, in mountain bunkers, and rural workshops were hundreds of unfinished radar sets, prototypes that might have rivaled Allied technology if only they had come sooner. Schematics lay scattered among rubble. Coils of copper wire and vacuum tubes lay buried beneath debris. The Japanese had finally believed, but far too late. Among those investigators was a group from the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, the very institution where America's radar story had begun a decade earlier. They walked through the wreckage with a strange mix of pride and melancholy. Their invention had saved lives, yes, but it had also become the harbinger of a new kind of warfare, one where no place, no ship, no human could ever again move unseen. As the occupation began, American officers interviewed Japan's surviving radar engineers. Some spoke openly, others with quiet shame. One scientist from the Naval Technical Research Institute admitted, "We thought it was science fiction. We had the minds, but not the faith."
That sentence became the epitaph for an entire era of Japanese science, brilliant minds trapped by disbelief. But even as Japan mourned, the world moved forward, racing into an age where radar became the heartbeat of modern civilization. What began as a secret weapon of war would soon guide airliners through storms, track hurricanes, control air traffic, and monitor the weather across the globe. The same waves that once detected bombers and warships would now protect the lives of civilians. In the United States, the scientists of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, who had once slept beside radar consoles in wartime, transitioned to peacetime research. Many of them would go on to pioneer microwave communications, television, and the foundations of what would become modern computing. The same technology that saved the U.S. fleet at Midway was now shaping the future of information itself. But radar's greatest legacy was not just technological, it was psychological. It had taught humanity a brutal lesson, that the future of warfare belonged to perception. The wars of tomorrow would not be won merely by courage, firepower, or numbers, but by knowledge, by the ability to detect, to anticipate, to understand before the enemy could react. Radar had opened the door to the era of electronic warfare, of satellites, of surveillance, of intelligence so precise it could predict the movement of armies before they marched. In the years after the war, Japan, reborn under occupation, turned its defeated engineering culture into one of innovation. Many of the same scientists who had struggled to build radar under wartime pressure now contributed to peaceful technologies, from broadcasting systems to semiconductor research. The lessons of radar, though painful, became seeds for Japan's technological renaissance. Yet the shadows of the war lingered. In naval archives and declassified reports, the story of radar's triumph remained a symbol of humility and human frailty, a reminder of how arrogance can blind even the brightest minds. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been one of the most disciplined forces in history, yet discipline without curiosity had doomed it. They had worshipped the visible, ships, guns, airplanes, and the bravery of men. America had trusted the invisible, waves, signals, electrons, and the intellect of scientists. In that contrast lay the fate of the Pacific. As the Cold War dawned, radar evolved once more, from the seas to the skies, from detection to deterrence. The massive radar arrays that guarded North America, stretching from Alaska to Greenland, formed the DEW Line, the first global shield against nuclear attack. The same principle that once guided pilots over Midway now watched for the faintest sign of an approaching missile. The war of vision had become eternal. For those who had lived through the Pacific conflict, radar became more than a tool. It was a ghost. Veterans remembered the green glow of screens in dark rooms, the faint hum of power, the tiny blips that meant friend or death. Many said they could still hear it in their dreams, the rhythmic pulse of a radar sweep, like the heartbeat of a world that refused to sleep again. In Japan, engineers rebuilt their nation from the ashes, determined never to be caught blind again. Universities established research programs in physics and electronics. Within a generation, Japan became a global leader in radar technology, telecommunications, and microelectronics. The irony was not lost on history. The same nation that once thought radar impossible now built some of the finest radar systems on Earth. And so, the legacy of radar became a mirror, reflecting both triumph and tragedy, arrogance and awakening. It was proof that knowledge is the ultimate weapon, and ignorance its own defeat. When historians look back at the Pacific War, they see the carriers, the planes, the islands. But behind all those images lies something unseen, a silent revolution of science, invisible yet unstoppable. Radar did not just win battles. It changed how humanity perceives the world. It taught nations to listen to the whispers of the unseen, to measure reality not by what the eyes can see, but by what the mind can detect. As the decades passed, the oceans where the fleets once clashed
became peaceful again. Fishermen sailed over the graves of ships that radar had doomed. Tourists visited Midway, where seabirds now nest among the ruins of bunkers and gun emplacements. The echoes of war had faded into history, but the pulse of radar, that faint, rhythmic hum, still beats in every airport, every ship, every storm warning, every satellite. The technology, born in fear, became a guardian of peace. And so, the story comes full circle. What the Japanese engineers once called impossible became the force that defined the modern world. The invisible weapon that destroyed their fleet would later guide their children home safely through the night skies. Because, in the end, radar was never just about war. It was about vision, and the eternal truth that those who dare to see the unseen will always shape the future. To the untrained eye, radar looked like science fiction. To the generals of the day, it seemed almost mystical, the idea that one could see through fog, through night, through clouds, without light or eyes. Yet in a small, cramped lab at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., a handful of men were proving that invisible waves could become the sharpest weapon in modern warfare. Men like Robert Page, who in 1934 sent out a radio pulse, waited for its echo, and realized he could see a plane long before his eyes could. The United States, at that time, was not yet at war. Isolationist voices filled Congress, but the Navy, always cautious of surprise attacks, had begun to pay attention. In those quiet pre-war years, a handful of physicists and engineers labored in obscurity, developing strange antenna arrays and cathode ray displays that flickered with ghostly blips. Few realized it then, but those flickering dots would one day decide the fate of entire fleets. Across the Pacific, Japanese engineers were also experimenting with radio waves, but they faced an uphill battle. Japan's industry, brilliant in mechanical precision, lagged behind in electronic innovation. When their physicists tried to create a radar set in 1936, they found the vacuum tubes unreliable, the oscillators unstable, the power outputs too weak. Their high command, more entranced by the glory of battleships and torpedoes, dismissed radar as an impractical toy. "Eyes of steel are enough," one admiral famously said. The Japanese Navy believed in visibility, discipline, and speed, not invisible waves. Meanwhile, American minds were quietly preparing to change the nature of visibility itself. Radar development became a secret race against time. Laboratories were established under code names. Funding trickled in quietly from the military, cloaked as communications research. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, or RadLab, was born in 1940. It would soon become one of the most powerful centers of innovation in human history. Inside its walls, a new generation of scientists, many barely out of graduate school, were about to turn invisible energy into the eyes of an empire. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, radar had already arrived, but America hadn't yet learned how to listen. On that fateful morning, a radar operator at Opana Point in Oahu picked up a massive formation of planes approaching from the north. The equipment was working perfectly, the warning was real, but the message was ignored. The system was too new, the training too shallow, the disbelief too strong. Commanders thought it was a flight of American B-17s. By the time the bombs began to fall, radar had done its job, but humanity had failed to trust it. The blips on the screen had been America's first look at its enemy, and no one was looking back. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The U.S. Navy and Army realized that the next war would not be fought solely with steel and gunpowder, but with information, with the power to see what others could not. Radar development accelerated like never before. Every ship, every base, every aircraft was to become part of an invisible web that reached across the oceans. The scientists at the Rad Lab were given a blank check, and they responded with miracles. New magnetrons,
capable of producing microwaves at unprecedented power, turned bulky radar systems into compact, deadly tools. By 1942, the British had already shown the Americans the power of radar during the Battle of Britain. Those giant towers along the English coast, the Chain Home Network, had given the Royal Air Force the ability to intercept German bombers before they reached the mainland. The technology was still crude, but the concept was proven. Radar could win wars. America took that knowledge and amplified it with industrial might. Now the Pacific would become the proving ground. The vastness of that ocean, with its endless blue horizons and islands scattered like stepping stones, made traditional scouting nearly impossible. Radar was the answer, and the Japanese didn't yet know how blind they really were. On the decks of American carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, radar antennas began to spin silently, sweeping the skies and seas. The operators, often young men trained in mere weeks, stared at glowing screens that revealed blips moving miles away, unseen to the naked eye. They were learning a new language of war, the rhythm of pings and echoes that could predict death before it arrived. Back in Japan, engineers were scrambling to catch up. They had begun to realize too late that their enemies possessed something they did not, a sixth sense, a way to see through darkness. Their laboratories worked feverishly to develop countermeasures, but the lack of reliable high-frequency components crippled their efforts. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which once prided itself on striking from the shadows, was about to become the hunted. By 1943, radar-equipped American ships could spot enemy aircraft 100 miles away, track incoming torpedoes, and navigate through the blackest nights. Entire fleets could coordinate without firing a flare or flashing a signal light. Japan's great advantage, surprise, was gone. The ocean, once their ally, had turned against them. The silent waves that had carried their attack planes to Pearl Harbor were now carrying something else, the echoes of their doom. But the true power of radar was not just in detection, it was in transformation. It turned strategy into precision, chaos into control. American commanders could now make decisions with knowledge the enemy didn't have. Battles that once depended on chance and courage now depended on information, and radar was rewriting the art of war itself. The Japanese had entered the war believing radar was impossible. Now, as their ships vanished one by one into the abyss, they were learning what impossible truly meant. The Americans had found a way to see the unseen, to strike with eyes that never closed, to move through the night like ghosts. And in that invisible realm of radio waves, the empire of the rising sun was already beginning to fade. The Pacific, vast and endless, stretched like a sheet of blue steel beneath the June sun of 1942. The air shimmered with heat, and every sailor aboard the U.S. carriers knew something was coming, something immense. For months, Japan had ruled these waters unchallenged, sweeping across the Pacific with an aura of invincibility. Their navy, disciplined and deadly, had taken the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their Zero fighters dominated the skies. Their fleets struck with precision and speed that stunned the world. But now, somewhere in this ocean, the hunter was about to become the hunted. The American fleet was smaller, battered from previous engagements, its ships hastily repaired, its men hardened by loss. Yet it carried something Japan did not, the power of foresight. The secret of radar was no longer confined to laboratories. It had been installed on ships, aircraft, and islands, quiet, humming eyes that could pierce through distance and deception. And now, at a tiny atoll called Midway, that invisible advantage would change history. The battle's prelude had been set in motion by a game of intelligence and timing. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval code, learning that AF, their target, was Midway. But knowledge alone was not enough.
To prepare for the ambush, the U.S. Navy needed to see its enemy first. That's where radar entered the stage. On the island of Midway, a small radar installation sat atop a dune, a skeletal antenna turning endlessly, sweeping the sky for echoes. Inside a cramped hut filled with the hum of generators and the faint smell of sea salt, young operators scanned their screens. They were not warriors in the traditional sense, no rifles, no cockpits, yet they held the power to sense danger before it struck. Every flicker, every pulse of light on that circular display was a heartbeat of the Pacific. At dawn on June 4, 1942, one of those blips appeared, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A formation of aircraft, many dozens strong, was moving toward Midway. The radar scope had picked them up 90 miles out, giving the Americans precious minutes to act. Alarms were sounded, pilots sprinted to their planes. Anti-aircraft gunners took their positions. Within moments, the sky above the atoll filled with the roar of engines. The Japanese attack had begun, but this time the defenders were not blind. The first waves of bombers descended upon Midway, their payloads shrieking toward the airfield. Explosions tore through the sand and steel, but much of the island's defense had already mobilized. Thanks to radar's warning, American fighters were airborne, intercepting the incoming bombers before they could complete their run. It wasn't a complete victory. Many planes were lost, the island burned in places, but the advantage of early warning had done its job. The Japanese believed they had achieved surprise. In truth, the surprise was already gone. Far to the east, beyond the horizon, 3 American carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, waited. Their decks were alive with motion, filled with the scent of oil, sweat, and aviation fuel. Pilots tightened their goggles, mechanics loaded bombs and torpedoes. And above them, radar dishes rotated ceaselessly, sweeping the skies for any sign of the enemy. In that era, naval combat was often decided by who spotted whom first. Before radar, it had been the eyes of scouts, the luck of positioning, and the gamble of timing. But now, those mechanical eyes made the difference between survival and annihilation. By mid-morning, American scouts, guided partly by radar direction, had confirmed the Japanese fleet's position. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed confidently, their decks packed with aircraft, their commanders believing that the Americans were miles away and unaware. They had no idea that American eyes had already found them. Aboard the Enterprise, radar operators relayed bearings and distances as planes lifted off one by one, climbing into the blinding sunlight. Their orders were clear: find the enemy and strike hard. The air was filled with tension, every pilot knowing the odds. But behind that courage lay a deeper confidence, the quiet trust in the unseen science that guided them. When the American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet hours later, it was chaos and fire. The Japanese, caught mid-resupply, had fuel lines stretched across their decks, bombs stacked in hangars. They had just finished rearming for a second strike when the first shadows fell from the clouds. Moments later, screaming engines and whistling bombs tore the air apart. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were engulfed in flames. The sea boiled with burning oil and shattered steel. The Akagi, pride of the Imperial Navy, was mortally wounded. The Kaga was an inferno. The Soryu sank beneath waves choked with smoke. Only Hiryu remained, launching a desperate counterattack that managed to cripple the Yorktown, but her fate too was sealed by afternoon. Radar-guided direction allowed American ships to reposition, rearm, and launch counterstrikes faster than the enemy could adapt. By nightfall, Hiryu joined her sisters in the depths. The Battle of Midway was over. The ocean, once Japan's kingdom, had turned against its masters. Radar had not fired a single bullet, but its echoes had rewritten destiny.
It had given the U.S. the power to prepare, to strike, and to survive. Those faint radio pulses, born from scientific curiosity a decade earlier, had become the difference between annihilation and victory. Midway was not just a clash of ships and aircraft, it was the first great triumph of the Invisible War, the Battle of Information.
For the Japanese, the loss was more than material, it was spiritual. 4 carriers, the heart of their offensive power, were gone. The pilots who had conquered Pearl Harbor were lost. And deep within their command structure, a grim realization began to take root. The Americans were fighting with eyes that never closed. Back in Washington, the news arrived with disbelief and relief. The tide had turned. In the laboratories of MIT, in the radar shacks across the Pacific, the scientists and engineers who had built the impossible could finally breathe. Their invention, once dismissed as theory, had become the guardian angel of fleets. But even as America celebrated, a new truth was dawning. Radar was no longer just a weapon of detection, it was the beginning of an entirely new era of warfare. An era where victory belonged not to the strongest or fastest, but to those who could see first. Midway was not the end of Japan's empire, but it was the moment its fate was sealed. From that day onward, every ship that sailed, every plane that flew, every decision that would be made in the Pacific would unfold beneath the watchful, invisible eyes of radar. The wreckage of the Japanese fleet smoldered beneath the waves of the Pacific, 4 of its mighty carriers now tombs for thousands of sailors and airmen. The once invincible Imperial Navy had been struck a blow so deep it shook the very soul of Japan. The sun still rose over the empire, but its light had dimmed. The Battle of Midway had not only crippled Japan's naval strength, it had exposed something far more dangerous: technological blindness. In the smoky conference rooms of Tokyo, the surviving admirals and engineers gathered to make sense of the disaster. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, stared across the long table, his face carved with exhaustion. The reports were relentless. Enemy aircraft had arrived before being sighted, their attack perfectly timed, their coordination precise, their carriers hidden until it was too late. The Americans had known, they had seen, and no one in that room could explain how. Whispers began to spread through the ranks of Japan's scientific and military elite. Radar. The word, unfamiliar to many, carried a weight of mystery. Some engineers had mentioned it before the war, dismissed by the high command as theoretical nonsense. Others had tried to build crude prototypes, only to be told their work was not suited to the fighting spirit of the Imperial Navy. Now, those same skeptics demanded answers. At the Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo, the empire's most brilliant minds were summoned. Among them was Professor Hidetsugu Yagi, whose name had once echoed in Western universities. He had invented a directional antenna, the Yagi-Uda array, that would later become one of radar's essential components. Ironically, while Yagi's work had been published and quickly adopted by American and British scientists, his own government had barely noticed. Japan had the brain that had given radar its spine, yet never the vision to see its future. By 1943, Japan's laboratories began to hum with belated urgency. Engineers scoured wrecked American aircraft and salvaged fragments from downed bombers, desperate for clues. They pieced together circuits, amplifiers, and magnetrons, attempting to reverse engineer what they did not fully understand. Factories, already strained by shortages of copper, rubber, and fuel, were ordered to produce radar sets. Yet the result was chaos.